welcome back to another episode of the Envisiontech podcast. I'm your host, Paul Gagan, and this week we're going to be reviewing some popular accessibility tools. Obviously, if you've heard the podcast before, you have heard me talk a lot about different screen readers and all sorts of different things, really, that people with disabilities, especially blind people, might be using. And if you haven't heard of those before, you don't know why there are multiple screen readers, quite likely, and you don't know what the difference between them is. Or if you are blind or have a disability yourself, maybe you're not sure whether or not you're using the right tools or whether there's anything better that you could be using. So that's kind of what we wanted to talk about in this episode, to explore a couple of those different tools, maybe talk about some of their advantages and disadvantages. For example, some of them are free, which is great, but some of them are very expensive. And it can honestly be quite surprising if you don't know kind of about these sorts of things, how expensive it can get to use some of these different softwares and things like that. One of the first things that we're going to cover here are screen readers. So if you don't know what a screen reader is at this point, it is essentially a piece of software that lets somebody who can't see or who has low vision to use a computer. It is called a screen reader because it quite literally reads what's on your screen. And no, it doesn't read everything that's on the screen all at once. It reads it depending on what you have selected. So when I press the arrow keys, it will read whatever item on my desktop, for example, is selected. Or if I'm using the up and down arrow keys when I'm in a document, it will read the document line by line. And there are, more complicated things about them, and we might talk about those later on in this episode, but that is essentially what a screen reader is if you've never heard of it before. And there are a lot of different screen readers out there. And not only that, but they aren't necessarily the same depending on what platform you use. For example, there will be different screen readers available on Android or on Windows. And some of those platforms have multiple screen readers available, whereas some of them don't. So we're going to talk through some of the more popular options here, because there are actually a lot of other options, but we won't get to cover them all. And you will get an understanding as to why somebody might prefer one over the other, or some of the problems that there actually are with these sorts of tools. The first screen reader on our list here is actually one that is built into Windows. It's actually called, Windows Narrator. So, the idea of the name there is that it narrates Windows. So, this is, I said, built into Windows. So, it is the default screen reader that comes with every computer, and you can turn it on really easily. I believe when you are setting up your computer, it actually asks you if you want to turn it on. And if you want to try it yourself, you can press Control, the Windows key, and Enter, and that should actually turn it on. Obviously, that's great that it is built in. So that's kind of one of the main strengths here, is that it's actually built into Windows, right? So it is made by Microsoft. So it kind of has a bit of an advantage there, given that obviously Microsoft should know what they're doing when it comes to making Windows accessible. Obviously, it can read things like text, buttons, and other elements on the screen, but again, that's similar across pretty much all screen readers. So it allows for a lot of the same basic features as a lot of other screen readers. Microsoft has also made a lot of improvements in Narrator over the years. They've improved things like Braille support even, which I know it might seem a bit confusing that a screen reader would support Braille. Well, a lot of screen readers actually do support Braille. So what will happen is you'll have a Braille display, which if you haven't heard of those, essentially it's just something that you plug into your computer or connect via Bluetooth, and it will, whatever text is on your screen essentially, or whatever the screen reader was going to say, it will actually show it up on this Braille display in Braille. But that is done through your screen reader a lot of the time. There isn't necessarily separate software for that. And that's one of the things that Microsoft has actually improved a lot over the years, is that kind of inbuilt Braille support. They also offer a lot of other basic features, which I'm just going to kind of mention for Narrator, and then we probably won't mention them again. You can do things with a lot of screen readers, like change the speed at which it talks, the pitch, the volume. A lot of the time you can change the voices that it speaks in, so you could have like a UK male voice, or you could have like a US female voice, or whatever it might be. And they also support a lot of different languages. It's obviously not just English, and that will vary wildly depending on the screen reader that you're using, to be honest with you. So narrator does struggle with a few things though. For example, it does struggle with more complex sort of tasks, especially if you're doing something involving like a more complicated spreadsheet, for example. And it can honestly struggle quite a bit with that. So that is definitely not great. And in terms of web accessibility, narrator is definitely not top of the list in terms of supporting things when you're navigating the web, and maybe being the best at being able to navigate around on the web either. It also has a bit of a learning curve. It's not necessarily the same as other screen readers, at least in how it functions and some of the shortcuts and things like that. So if you're coming from another screen reader to narrator, it can be quite different, which is obviously a big disadvantage because you don't really want to have to invest more time into learning how to use a screen reader, given that you've already done that before. So that's obviously not ideal. Now, an interesting statistic here is that 70% of screen reader users actually prefer to use a screen reader on Windows, and that is quite likely due to the explicit use of Windows in professional environments and the availability of different apps on Windows. So that's less so to do with narrator itself and more so to do with Windows. Me personally, I am not the biggest fan of narrator, and I only really use it when I am setting up a computer. So I will use narrator when I set up a computer, and then I will go and install another screen reader, which we'll talk about later on in this list, which is the one that I personally use. But narrator is definitely not a bad choice. I haven't really come across any other blind person using it. It doesn't mean that they don't, but I think part of the problem is just narrator used to be a lot worse than the other screen readers. But even if it has caught up now, a lot of people already have a screen reader that they like, so they're less likely to want to switch. So if you are maybe, thinking of using narrator to even like test your websites, or if you are somebody who's blind or whatever, and you're thinking of what screen reader you might want to use, narrator isn't necessarily a bad choice, and it's definitely better than it used to be. The second one on the list here, which you will definitely hear about if you hear somebody talking about screen readers, is VoiceOver. And now VoiceOver is available on macOS, but it's also available on any iOS-based device, essentially. And I don't believe it's the same screen reader, but they have the same name. So it is important to realize that, as far as I'm aware, they aren't necessarily the same screen reader, but they do have the same name, and they are made by Apple directly. So these are essentially part of the Apple ecosystem. They are not available on any other platform except for Apple devices. So if you have an Android device, you cannot use VoiceOver. Same with if you're running something on Linux or Windows or whatever, you have to be using an Apple device in order to use macOS. To use VoiceOver on macOS. And that's specifically what we're going to talk about right now. We're going to talk about using VoiceOver on macOS. So that is the built-in screen reader for macOS. So it's essentially Apple's equivalent to Windows Narrator. Now, there are quite a few strengths to VoiceOver. For example, obviously, since it's made by Apple, it has really good integration with the Apple ecosystem. So it's tightly integrated with macOS and Apple's ecosystem, providing a pretty seamless experience across devices. So I said if you're using a Mac, an iPhone, or like an iPad, for example, it's quite likely that you'll be able to have a good experience on an app across all three of those different platforms if you're using VoiceOver. So that is a huge advantage. If you are kind of in that Apple ecosystem and you find yourself using a lot of Apple software, then VoiceOver is definitely a good choice for you. And it might honestly be worth considering using something like a Mac instead of a actual Windows PC in that case. And I think Mac OS is pretty not Mac OS. VoiceOver is actually pretty popular, um, in terms of people who use screen readers, because a lot of people who are blind actually do get iPhones, for example, specifically for VoiceOver, and because they, um, kind of trust that Apple ecosystem to be accessible. So I will say that Apple does actually put a lot of work into making things accessible. So it's also known for its user experience. Um, it has pretty good like gesture support, voice controls, and a well sort of designed interface that a lot of people find really easy to navigate. And again, that's just Apple. Like Apple's kind of known for that, at least relatively sort of sleek experience, and that's pretty easy to use. You know, so that obviously kind of runs over to VoiceOver, and it gets that same sort of treatment you'd expect from an Apple product. So again, if you're in that ecosystem and you like Apple's sort of approach to how they make their apps, then you would definitely probably like VoiceOver. So it does have some more advanced features, such as screen router and quick access to various functions and options. So it is pretty nice there that you can really sort of quickly change like certain settings or get access to certain options for VoiceOver, because that isn't necessarily true of all screen readers. And that's honestly a bit of a pain with some screen readers. Sometimes I wish that they had more shortcuts so that you could easily change settings when you needed to. For example, something that you might want to do is change the punctuation that your screen reader will read. So you can actually tell it what level of punctuation to read. So you can tell it to read all the punctuation in some text, you can tell it to read some of it or none of it. And depending on what you're doing, you might want to change those settings very quickly. And not all screen readers have an easy way to do that. So for example, when I'm coding, I want to know about all the punctuation, but if I'm just listening to a text message, for example, I probably don't really care about all the full stops, commas, exclamation marks, brackets, etc., etc., etc. I just want to hear the actual message itself. So it is pretty nice that they provide an easy way to change settings like that. Now, because this is pretty tightly integrated with Apple's own software, you can sometimes run into some problems when using third-party software. And that can be a bit of an issue. Now, in general, if you are using an app on iOS or something like that, there will be pretty good support. But if it is maybe available on multiple platforms, like that app, for example, then maybe it won't prioritize VoiceOver support. So you may run into issues with that. So you can have issues navigating around on those apps, for example. There are also quite a few commands with VoiceOver, so if you are maybe new to using a screen reader, it could be a bit daunting to kind of get used to those, but it's also quite powerful to have that range of commands. It also has a little bit less customization options, which is fairly typical for Apple. They provide a pretty good out-of-the-box experience, and if you want to change that, you can't really. You can, they do definitely have some customization settings, but compared to other screen readers, again, you kind of get the regular Apple treatment. It's pretty good for a good amount of people, but there are going to be people out there who want more from a screen reader in terms of customization, so it can definitely have an impact on your sort of experience there. This next screen reader on our list is actually the one that I personally use, and it's called NVDA. Now, NVDA stands for Non-Visual Desktop Access, and I mean, it's really in the name. It allows you to access your desktop in a non-visual way. And NVDA is exclusive to Windows and is one of the two most popular screen readers for Windows. NVDA and another one that you'll hear about later on called JAWS. Now, NVDA has quite a few strengths, and the first one of those is that it's free. And just to clarify, VoiceOver and Narrator are also free, but a lot of these screen readers that aren't necessarily made by the company who makes the operating system. So for example, Apple makes Mac OS and Microsoft makes Narrator. So when you pay for a Windows license or for a Mac or an iPhone, you're getting iOS with that. So obviously you're going to get the screen reader that's built in there. Like you are kind of paying for the screen reader as part of the cost of that device or the operating system. Whereas NVDA is completely free. It is not part of Windows by default. It is not in any way, as far as I'm aware, developed by Windows. It is actually open source. So that means that you can actually go online right now. You can look up, you can type into Google NVDA GitHub, and you'll be able to see all of the code for NVDA. And if you want, you can go ahead and change it. So that's kind of why it's free. Well, at least part of the reason why it's free. So if you're not familiar with open source, basically that means that anybody can contribute to it. And it doesn't mean that you can go on there and add in anything you want. Because there are some people who are dedicated to working on NVDA and who are part of, I believe it's a foundation, that kind of run that GitHub and kind of decide what features to add, etc. But you can be involved in the development if you want. So NVDA is totally free, which I said is unusual for a third-party screen reader like this. And NVDA is, as far as I'm aware, I said, one of the two most popular screen readers, and I feel like has only been sort of gaining popularity as time has gone on. So NVDA is also compatible with just about anything. And I feel like part of the reason for that is because it's free. If you're a web developer and you want to test your website with a screen reader, you could do it with Narrator, but honestly, as I said, I don't know how widely used Narrator is. Or you could do it with NVDA, which is free, and you know that a lot of people are using NVDA. So you don't have to pay anything, and you can use a screen reader that you know a lot of people are using. So a lot of people will use NVDA to test their websites or their apps. So that's a big reason why it's compatible with a lot of different apps and websites. And especially for web-based content, it is really known for supporting that pretty well. And now, don't get me wrong, it does have its problems, like all screen readers do, but NVDA in general is very good, especially for kind of anything that you're doing in a browser. And obviously that doesn't mean that every app or website will be accessible to NVDA. There are definitely still some that aren't, but that isn't really the fault of the screen reader. That's more so the fault of the developers of that app or website in that case. As I mentioned, NVDA is open source, and it has really strong community support. It gets very frequent updates, and it changes a lot based on user feedback. So right now you can go and download an alpha version of NVDA or a beta version of NVDA or the actual release version of NVDA, and you can give them feedback on it, and they will actually change the direction that they're going in possibly based on your feedback. And I've seen a lot of features get added into NVDA because of user feedback. Somebody will say, hey, actually this feature would be really helpful, could we add that in? Or hey, I found this issue with NVDA, could this be fixed? And then next thing you know, in the next release, it's fixed or it's added. So there is a huge support there for NVDA from the community and just the maintainers of NVDA itself. So yeah, definitely really great, and that is lacking a lot in a lot of other screen readers. If you want a feature to be added to, for example, Windows Narrator, I mean, it's kind of like asking for them to add a feature to Windows. How likely is it to really happen? And I'm not saying it won't, it might, but it's not going to be the same as it is with something like NVDA. Now, NVDA does have a few weaknesses, and I've experienced these myself for sure. And that's, coming from somebody who uses NVDA every day, and I honestly wouldn't really like to use any other screen reader over it. But there can be some performance problems, if you will, with NVDA. And it's fine a lot of the time, don't get me wrong, but when I've opened like a particularly large document or something like that, NVDA might take a while to start speaking again while it tries to process everything that it's trying to read. So, and that makes total sense just to say, I totally understand why, but it is something to bear in mind. If you're going to be working with really big, sort of complicated things, NVDA maybe might cause you some problems. NVDA obviously doesn't have the exact same features as every other screen reader. However, NVDA does have a huge marketplace, and you can actually develop extensions or plugins for NVDA to add new functionality. You can actually add new languages kind of to NVDA now. They're technically character sets, but that's from a very recent update. I actually don't think it's in the release version of NVDA just yet. I was involved in testing that, and it was actually a very cool project. So yeah, and it uses an open source Braille translator as well, so it has access to well over 100 Braille like different Braille languages and tables, and it has pretty much everything you could want. And if it doesn't, then somebody else has probably made that feature or support for that app that you want. There's even like extensions out there that will make using certain apps like Outlook better. They'll add new shortcuts, or they'll help make it more accessible, or whatever it might be. And the thing is, if what you want isn't out there, you can make it, or you could maybe get somebody else to make it for you. So that's another really cool thing about NVDA, is that you can add features to it if you want. NVDA does, however, have a little bit less in terms of customization and some other features than some other paid offerings. And this will sort of impact things like the voice synthesizer. So the actual voices that NVDA has might not be as good as an actual paid screen reader. Now, and there are ways around that. You can actually buy voice synthesizers separately. But obviously, that's at a cost, and that's not actually part of NVDA. So that's worth keeping in mind for sure. The next screen reader here on our list is one called JAWS, or Job Access with Speech. And I actually didn't realize that's what that acronym stood for until making the show notes for this episode, actually. So I just always knew it as JAWS, and I just never really thought about why it was called JAWS. It always just reminded me of the movie with the shark. But yeah, so Job Access with Speech. So obviously it's meant for more of a professional environment, or at least that's kind of why it was brought about. So JAWS offers a lot of features, and JAWS is a paid screen reader, and we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. But it offers a comprehensive set of features, including advanced scripting, Braille support, and customizable settings. And they do have a lot of different customization options there that some other screen readers may not have access to. So I will also say that it does also have pretty high performance. It has really excellent performance with a range of different applications and more complicated tasks, which again, some other screen readers may kind of struggle with. It also has really good support. Obviously, you're paying for it, so you're going to be able to get access to support, and there's a lot of extensive documentation there on JAWS, which obviously they can afford to invest time into because it's paid. So, weaknesses. Obviously, it's cost, right? Cost is number one. So, JAWS is a commercial product with a high price tag. So, this is going to be a barrier for some, if not a lot of users, and I certainly know that's exactly why I personally don't use JAWS. I have used JAWS quite extensively in the past, but I will not be using it again quite likely. And my problem with JAWS, I shouldn't say my problem because I understand why they have it this way, but if you buy a license for JAWS, it's just that, it's a license. And you can only use it on a certain amount of devices, and after a couple of years, your license, I don't think it technically expires, but you stop getting updates. And if you want to get more updates, you have to buy a new license. And licenses aren't cheap. I believe they start at around €800, and they go up from there. Because I believe there are different types of licenses, so you can get different ones. But that is obviously a pretty high price point. That's the cost of a new computer or laptop, and you can get a computer or laptop for way less than that actually, but that's a pretty decent computer or laptop for most people. Or you could buy a screen reader, So it's honestly pretty hard to justify for me personally, but some people really like JAWS. and they have a really good experience with JAWS, and they personally don't like something like NVDA. I've heard a lot of people say actually that they don't like NVDA at all, and they could never switch from JAWS to NVDA. So it's also about personal preference and what you're using it for. Obviously, JAWS can be quite complex and has a much steeper learning curve than something like NVDA. For example, with NVDA, you can just start using it. You don't really need to do anything. A lot of the more advanced features are available if you want them, but they are essentially purely optional. Whereas with JAWS, it's a little bit less beginner friendly, if you will. I said it's kind of more so for like a commercial environment. Now, there have been sometimes, obviously, where updates and stuff have caused problems with JAWS, as far as I've seen. And I've experienced that myself. When I've installed JAWS before, certain versions don't work correctly. Some of them have actually caused my computer to crash. And that can happen with any piece of software, but as far as I've read and have seen, that has happened often-ish with JAWS. I don't have an exact statistic on that, so you don't need to take my word on it, but just in my experience and from what I've seen. But again, this screen reader, JAWS, and NVDA are definitely the two most popular screen readers, despite the fact that NVDA is free and JAWS is rather expensive. It still does remain a very popular choice, which does really say that it probably is quite good and that a lot of people really do like it. So clearly, it's not just expensive to be expensive. It's clearly expensive, but it's still good. So JAWS is definitely still a good choice, certainly for some people anyway. So it turns out that there is actually a lot to talk about when it comes to these different tools. So we're actually going to end up doing a multiple part series on this topic. And it actually works out quite well because we were actually not going to have episodes for the next 2 weeks. But now I'm going to record these next parts and I'll upload these separately. So this will be a multi-part series now. So this has been part 1, which will be about screen readers. Next time, we'll be talking about things like very popular applications you might be used to, like Excel, for example, and how they work with screen readers or how they don't. And many more different topics to talk about. So make sure that you come back next time if you found this interesting. As always, I've been your host, Paul Gagan. Thank you for listening to the Envisiontech podcast, and I will see you all next week.